Welcome to another wonderful Grace Austen audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Regency romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Grace Austen, Regency romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Miss Modesty's Mistletoe. Chapter 1. Berkshire, England, December 1816. We have been invited to the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball. Modesty gives her the note of delight in her mother's voice and could not miss the rapturous expression on her face. Clearly, the older woman was much more thrilled by the prospect than she was. Georgina Gibbs waved the invitation she held in her hand in triumph, her round face flushed, as though her excitement was simply too much for her to contain. "I must inform your father at once." She rushed out of the front parlor and through the marble foyer toward her husband's study. Modesty trailed behind her mother at a slower pace, until she'd reached the foot of the grand staircase, and then she veered off, intending to head up to her bedchamber on the floor above. As she mounted the first step, she saw her mother fling wide the door to her father's study without pausing to knock first, leaving the wood panel standing open as she entered the room. "Oh, dear!" The older woman came to a sudden halt a few feet from the doorway. "I beg your pardon for intruding, Mr. Gibbs. I did not realize that Mr. Banfield had come to call upon you." At the older woman's words, Modesty stopped so abruptly that she almost toppled over and had to grasp onto the newel post to catch her balance. She felt an instant and strong pull toward the open study door, merely knowing that Felton Banfield was inside. Stepping down from the first stair, she edged closer to her father's study in order to listen to everything that was said. "It's quite all right, Mrs. Gibbs. I have concluded my business with your husband." Felton's deep voice sent delicious tingles through Modesty. Through the open door, she caught a glimpse of him standing in front of the wingback chair that faced her father's large mahogany desk. Her heart fluttered in response to the sight. Felton was as handsome as any of the titled peers other young girls sighed over, making absolute cakes of themselves to gain a particular gentleman's attention. Felton's red hair was styled in the latest fashion, his light blue eyes standing out in stark contrast to the bright hue of his hair. He was dressed in a sky blue embroidered waistcoat, with a dark green coat over it, and a snowy white cravat tied in an intricate knot at his neck. Buff-colored breeches clung to his well-formed muscled legs. Not that a proper young woman was supposed to notice such things, but after nearly 2 years of living in Paris with her French grandmother, Modesty found the typical English view on accepted behavior to be rather stifling. Never mind that she was 3/4 English herself. Felton bowed to her mother. "By your leave, Mrs. Gibbs, I'll see myself out." The older woman murmured her assent, and Felton exited the study. Modesty froze like a hare cornered by a fox. As Felton caught sight of her lingering in the hall, a slight smile curved the corners of his mouth. "Miss Gibbs, it's a pleasure to see you, as always, though I did not expect to find you here." He indicated the spot where she stood. She blushed at being discovered eavesdropping, but refused to acknowledge her ill-mannered actions. "What brings you to Stonebridge Manor, Mr. Banfield?" she inquired. His pale blue eyes lit with amusement, but he allowed her to evade the subject and redirect the conversation without issue. "I came to discuss a business matter with your father." "Are you undertaking a new venture?" "Nothing has been decided, thus far." His strong jaw firmed with resolve. She sensed he would not be moved to speak of it any further with her now, nor reveal the nature of his proposed dealings with her father. With no small effort, she reined in her curiosity. Felton looked ready to take his leave of her, but she wished to draw out her time with him for just a little longer. From inside her father's study, she could hear her mother relaying the news of their invitation to the Christmas ball hosted by the Duke of Kilmerstan. "Will you be attending the Duke's ball?" she asked in an attempt to delay his departure. "I received an invitation, but I shall most likely not be attending." He fingered the scar on his face that slashed across his cheekbone and upward toward his temple. Modesty realized her mistake instantly, as all lightness seemed to vanish from Felton's eyes, leaving them the color of the chill winter sky outside. She and Felton had been friends once, riding horses across the countryside during school holidays when they had lived on neighboring estates. but she hadn't seen much of him since her return from Paris following her grandmother's passing a month ago, and she had found Felton much changed from her fond memories of him. Though she had forgotten that for a time, when she'd caught sight of his warm smile a few moments ago. How could she have failed to remember the recent rumors she'd heard about Felton's scandalous actions and wicked reputation? She didn't want to believe them. Surely, the kind-hearted boy she'd known was still somewhere inside of the hard, cynical man standing before her now. Felton Banfield watched as Modesty's inquisitive expression dimmed like a flame of candlelight winking out, with only dark shadows left behind. He felt a large measure of regret for spoiling her bright mood. Her dark brown eyes clouded with remorse, and she sank small, white teeth into her plump bottom lip, leaving it tinged the color of a ripe berry. How thoughtless of me to mention it. Please, forgive me. Think nothing of it. He instinctively knew what she was thinking. He wanted no additional reminders of the dark period in his life, or his less than honorable deeds back then. As such, he didn't wish to prolong this line of conversation any further. Modesty seemed to understand his thinking, also, and changed the subject. Perhaps I will see you at Baron Ockley's country dance, the week after next. He nodded in acknowledgement. I have promised to escort my mother and younger sister. Oh, how do Mrs. Banfield and Victoria fare? I neglected to ask, and I have not had occasion to visit with them, since they are now living on your new estate. The 2 hours' drive from here to Lower Nettlefold can sometimes be inconvenient. They are well. Though he couldn't have said the same 1 year ago. Their improved situation was a source of great relief for him. Modesty smiled in response. Please, give them my best. Victoria just turned 16, did she not? Yes, earlier this year. She has not yet made her come out, but Mother wants her to have the opportunity to mix with genteel society here in the country before her first season in London next year. And if any young buck dared to try and take advantage of Victoria in the way that Felton had behaved toward the Duke of Kilmerstan's young sister, then Felton would be fighting another duel. And this time he would shoot to kill, instead of firing harmlessly into the air. He had felt he could do nothing less when Kilmerstan had demanded satisfaction for the Dishner done to his sister. But if Felton's sister was in any way compromised, he wouldn't merely aim to wound. He was fortunate that the Duke had chosen to spare him due to their former friendship, though their bond had been forever destroyed by Felton's desperate actions. Felton had no doubt that the only reason the other man continued to tolerate his presence was due to the fact that Lady Isabel had married, happily, by all accounts, and now resided in Yorkshire with her Marquis. Felton wasn't proud of the choices he'd made upon his return from the Battle of Waterloo. In fact, they had brought him great shame. But he'd seen no other way out, at that moment. No other option to saving his family, at least not then. And by the time he'd been presented with the means necessary to provide for them, he had already committed an act that darkened his soul and blackened his name. He pushed away those grim thoughts and focused his attention back on Modesty. A curl of her dark brown hair had come loose at her nape and draped over her shoulder. He longed to reach out and discover if it was as silky as it appeared. Her dress of navy blue merino wool highlighted her petite but curvy figure, and her pale skin reminded him of freshly fallen snow. Though he touched her cheek, he knew it would feel warm against his fingers. He curled his hands into fists in a bid to ignore the temptation. Any association with him beyond his business dealings with her father would only risk sullying Modesty's own reputation. And he could not allow that. Not only due to his high regard for her, but also because Mr. Gibbs, on the basis of his one-time friendship with Felton's father, had played a large role in Felton's successful endeavors to regain his family's former fortunes. It seemed that it was past time to make a hasty retreat before he did something else unforgivable toward an innocent female. I must be off. Modesty's mouth turned down at the corners, as though she would be disappointed to see him depart, but she didn't attempt to convince him to stay. Of course, Mr. Banfield. I wish you good day. He bowed to her in response. After collecting his hat and overcoat from the Gibbses' butler, he left Stonebridge Manor, and the woman who would always hold a very large piece of his heart. Chapter 2. We must make preparations for the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball, Georgina Gibbs announced the next morning as Modesty entered the breakfast room. Modesty silently scoffed at the way her mother persisted in referring to it as the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball, as if anyone would be confused about which ball she was referring to. Doubtless, she wished to ensure that all knew the Gibbs had been judged worthy of an invitation to the social event of the winter season in Upper Nettlefold, despite their lack of title or family connections. No matter that they were in the privacy of their own home, with no one but servants to hear, the older woman didn't alter her habits. Modesty's mother seemed to feel that she must compensate for the fact that her husband had made his fortune in trade, even though Reginald Gibbs was respected for his business acumen by progressive-thinking men such as His Grace, the Duke. To be fair to her mother, many of the more snobbish members of the ton disdained the Gibbses as poison mushrooms trying to act above themselves. But in that case, they looked on her mother's actions as proof that their estimation of the family was correct. Which, in turn, only made Georgina Gibbs try harder to claim a place amongst the highest levels of society where there were those who thought that by excluding others, it increased their own importance. And so it went, with one action feeding into the other in a seemingly endless circle. But any words of reasoning from Modesty fell on deaf ears, so she had learned to keep her thoughts on that particular subject to herself. Modesty moved to the sideboard to fill a china plate with a spoonful of eggs and 2 triangles of toast from the chafing dishes, and then joined her parents at the table. The older woman speared her with a critical gaze. "We must have a new gown made up for Modesty to wear for the occasion. We haven't much time. I propose a trip into Upper Nettlefold to the dressmaker's shop, this very day." "A wonderful idea, my dear," Modesty's father agreed, as he patted his mouth with a cloth napkin. "I have business in the village, as well. I shall have the carriage brought round, and we will leave directly after breakfast." Modesty remained silent, since it seemed that her opinion on the matter was not required, and she knew her mother wouldn't be swayed from her purpose, in any event. She resigned herself to spending the better part of the day with her mother, looking over drawings of the latest fashions and choosing fabrics, though Modesty's input regarding the selections would likely be superfluous to her mother's aims. Modesty busied herself spreading butter and jam on the triangles of toast, before lifting one to her mouth and taking a bite. She almost choked on the toast, crumbs scratching on the way down, as she swallowed too quickly at her father's next words. "By the night of the Duke's ball, your mother and I expect that you will have accepted a gentleman's suit." "A titled gentleman's suit," her mother inserted. Modesty took a hasty sip of tea to clear the obstruction from her throat. "But that's less than a month away. Besides, she had no desire to marry a man who was only interested in her father's fortune." The older woman looked to her husband. "Explain it to her, please, Reginald." Her father set down his fork and focused his entire attention on Modesty. "I'm sure I don't need to remind you that you'll be 21 in February. Your mother fears that if you end another season without announcing your betrothal, the ton will think you hopelessly on the shelf. But I've been in France the past 2 seasons. Surely." Her father held up a hand, cutting off further protests. "The fact remains that if the next season in London does not go favorably, it could very well end all hopes of you making an advantageous match. During your first 2 seasons a few years ago, before you hurried off to Paris to stay with your grandmother, God rest her soul, no less than 5 different gentlemen complained that you were too forthright and expressed opinions unbecoming in a proper young woman. Merely because she had made it plain she didn't wish to accept their suits. She did not flatter or simper, acting as many other young girls of her acquaintance. Nor did she offer blind adoration to the opposite gender simply because they had deigned to acknowledge her, though the male members of the ton seemed to expect it as their due. Still, Modesty had little doubt as to whom her father was referring. How like these men to lay the blame at her door, when every last one of them had been a fortune hunter, drawn by her large dowry rather than any liking or affection for her personally. When she married, she desired it to be a love match, no matter how uncommon that might be among the members of society. Yet, her parents seemed set on thwarting her dreams. "You will do as we request," her father stated his edict. "Yes, Papa." But her mind already raced with ways to avoid an unwanted marriage. Why this sudden rush to find her a husband? Clearly, her parents feared that her time in France had further encouraged her unseemly outspokenness, and they hoped to have her safely wed before the gentleman they deemed acceptable decided against courting her. If so, surely it wouldn't be too terribly difficult to circumvent their aims. Without behaving in such a way as to put her completely beyond the pale, of course. She didn't want to truly ruin herself so that no man would have her, love match or not. But how to go about it without her parents realizing what she was planning? Later that morning, after her father had gone off to attend to some business matters of his own, Modesty spent several hours with her mother at a shop on the main street of Upper Nettlefold, choosing fabrics and trimmings, and then discussing with the seamstress the design to be stitched for Modesty's new ball gown. She glanced out the window, in search of a reprieve from the talk of necklines and embellishments, and spotted Felton riding a handsome bay horse past the front of the shop. This only served to remind her of the fact that all this effort was going into a gown he would likely never see her wearing. At the same time, she couldn't bring herself to care about garnering the admiration of any other gentleman, no matter that her parents were determined that she should snag a titled husband. Unfortunately, Felton had never seemed inclined to court her and, thus, save her from the parents' ambitions, much to Modesty's discontent. He didn't appear to feel the same draw to her that she felt toward him. At least, he hadn't ever made the slightest of advances toward her that might indicate otherwise, despite his reputation as a rogue and a scoundrel. "Come right this way, Miss Gibbs," the seamstress instructed, interrupting Modesty's musings. She dutifully followed the other woman behind a curtain at the back of the shop, and then struggled to stand motionless while attired in only her undergarments, as she allowed the seamstress's assistant to take her measurements and jot them down on a piece of paper. At least, it was pleasantly warm in the shop. Finally, the young girl put away the measuring tape. Modesty quickly redonned her gown. The seamstress escorted her and her mother back to the front of the shop. "I shall have the gown ready for the first fitting by the end of the next week. It must be completed within a fortnight, no more," Modesty's mother insisted. "Of course, Mrs. Gibbs." The seamstress bobbed a curtsy. As they left the seamstress's shop, Modesty's mother pulled on her gloves and adjusted her hat. "Let us stop in at the Nettlerush tea room before we join your father and return home. He said he wouldn't be finished with his business until 3:15, and I'm famished from missing luncheon." Modesty shivered in the chill air and readily agreed to her mother's suggestion to seek refreshment and warmth from the biting winter cold outside. They spent a pleasant half-hour enjoying a pot of tea and savory mincemeat pies, though the older woman couldn't refrain from voicing numerous remarks about their visit to the dressmaker, lengthy descriptions of Modesty's new gown, and all manner of comments about the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball. However, as she didn't require any response from her daughter, Modesty paid her little mind, though it appeared the other ladies sitting at tables in the tea room were eager to catch every word, if their surreptitious eavesdropping was anything to judge by. Not that Modesty's mother was making any attempt to speak quietly. She seemed to want every lady present to overhear. A short time later, they left the tea room to make their way back to the spot where their carriage waited near the edge of the village. As the two women neared the Nettlefold Arms, Modesty spotted her father and Felton exiting the inn's taproom. Georgina Gibbs hailed her husband and tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, all but ignoring Felton's presence. But then, the younger man wasn't a titled gentleman. Therefore, he must be beneath her notice while she sought to marry off her daughter to a suitably elevated personage. Modesty cringed as her mother launched into a retelling of their recent endeavors, regaling her father with all the details of the gown they had ordered especially for the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball, of which Reginald Gibbs likely couldn't care less. But he tolerated it without protest, making noises of approval at the appropriate places, though Modesty suspected he was not paying any particular attention to his wife's words. Modesty hung back a few paces from her parents and was pleased to find Felton keeping pace with her. He clasped his hands at his back as he walked beside her. With the older woman carrying on so ahead of them, there was little chance that Felton wouldn't comprehend what Modesty and her mother had been occupied with in the village this day. But knowing that any reference to the Duke of Kilmerstan must pain him, she didn't wish to prolong his discomfort and sought to draw his attention away from her mother's discourse. "Did you have business with my father at the Nettlefold Arms Inn, or did you meet by happenstance?" she inquired, then added, "He didn't mention to mother and me that his business in the village was with you." "We met by chance. I had hoped to further discuss my proposition with your father when I chanced to see him taking refreshment in the common room." For all the good it had done Felton. But, alas, a frustrated sigh slipped out before he could catch it back. Modesty's eyes widened in surprise. "He refused you?" "No, at least, not yet. He is still undecided." Her dark eyebrows knit, pulling together above the bridge of her nose. "It's most unlike Papa to hesitate in matters of business. Felton nodded in acknowledgement. Unfortunately, he and Modesty's father had not come to any sort of agreement on this particular matter. The older man had asked for more time to think it over. True, it was a risky venture, riskier than any they had undertaken together before, but it had the potential to bring them a substantial profit. Although Reginald Gibbs' caution was admirable, Felton had not taken kindly to the older man likening him to his father, a man whose lack of good judgment and excessive vices had brought the family to the brink of ruin while Felton was away from England fighting Napoleon. He'd made his own share of mistakes the past 18 months, but he had thought he'd proved himself a different man than his father, if nothing else. Wise investments had seen a return of the Banfields' fortunes over the past year and a half. And Felton had hoped this latest business venture would increase their wealth by 1/4. Modesty cocked her head to the side. Perhaps if I knew the particulars of the venture, I might be able to speak with my father about it and sway this business to your favor by convincing him of its merit. Thank you, but no. If I have not provided sufficient proof of its merit, then perhaps it would be best not to move forward together as partners with your father. Although Felton was uncertain whether he wished to take on the entire risk himself. Not with his younger sisters come out fast approaching and his mother anticipating the need to buy all manner of things in addition to her plans to rent a lavish townhouse in London for the season. But that was a concern for another day. Felton continued to follow behind the elder Gibbses as they passed by the baker's shop, a boarding house, the local solicitor's office, St. Cuthbert's Church, and the Bell and Whistle coaching inn. As their procession neared the edge of town, they walked beside the Nettlerush River. A layer of ice had formed along the banks the previous night, when the surrounding countryside of Berkshire experienced an especially cold spell, but now the ice was beginning to melt in the weak winter sunshine. The sound of the rushing water reached Felton's ears, and further off, he could see the small flour mill located at the side of the river, its wooden water wheel turning slowly to grind the wheat and other grains harvested during the early fall by the tenant farmers living on the nearby estates. He noted the position of the sun as it sank toward the horizon. I must be heading home now, he stated with no small measure of reluctance at being forced from Modesty's company. But he had little desire to travel the roads after dark, when a lone rider could be easily set upon by highwaymen. It's more than an hour's ride to my estate in Lower Netterfold, he added by way of apology. He didn't miss Modesty's expression of disappointment, though she quickly tried to mask it. Might I look forward to seeing you in Upper Nettlefold and at Stonebridge Manor again soon? She asked. Undoubtedly. He wished Modesty and her parents good day, and then returned to where he'd left his horse at the stables behind the Nettlefold Arms Inn. But he couldn't help but take one last glance over his shoulder. He watched as Modesty disappeared inside the Gibbs carriage, and the driver urged the horses into motion. As the carriage rolled past him, he caught a glimpse of her face peering back at him through the window glass, her smile wistful. A moment later, the curtain fell into place once more, cutting off his view of her. Chapter 3. The next day, Modesty learned that her parents had begun their campaign in earnest to find her a titled husband. Your father has agreed that we shall host a dinner party and invite all the eligible gentlemen in the district to dine with us, Modesty's mother proclaimed during afternoon tea. We must send out the invitations without delay. Oh, and I'll have to consult Cook about the menu. It seemed the older woman was thinking aloud more than anything else, since she clearly didn't expect a response from her daughter. Not that Modesty could fool herself into believing protests from her would make a bit of difference against her mother's determination. Modesty sighed wearily. She was not looking forward to the occasion, but then every social gathering was nothing more than a trial to be merely endured, since her parents had decided that she should make a match with all haste. All effort must be made for fear that Modesty would otherwise end up on the shelf, an old maid with dismal if any prospects, if too much more time were allowed to pass. Yet Modesty would rather remain unmarried than to wed any of the gentlemen her parents might deem suitable. Older men entering their dotage, widowed nobles with a houseful of children, or impoverished peers who were more interested in her dowry than Modesty herself, a person with thoughts and feelings. Georgina Gibbs clapped her hands suddenly, startling Modesty into splashing several drops of tea over the rim of her china cup and onto the skirt of her pale lavender gown. Her mother appeared not to take any notice, as delight lit her expression. I have a wonderful idea. You must accompany the maids to collect mistletoe from the woods. Then we shall hang it in a number of spots around the rooms of Stonebridge Manor. Mistletoe? What would her mother think up next? Modesty shuddered to imagine. Would the older woman attempt to orchestrate a compromising situation to force Modesty into marriage with a man of her mother's choosing? Her mother didn't seem to have any requirements apart from a title. Would Modesty find herself wed to the 70-year-old Earl of Markham, who was still in need of an heir after burying 2 wives and half a dozen stillborn children? Or the widowed Marquis of Sedgwick with his 8 motherless sons? All in all, the Earl seemed more likely, since that would provide Georgina Gibbs with a grandson who would one day be an Earl, and in the not-too-distant future. Given that gentleman's age, Lord Markham could cock up his toes at any moment. As much as her mother might desire that, Modesty had no wish to be a widow mere days after becoming a wife, to say nothing of her distaste regarding the thought of her wedding night with a man who was old enough to be her grandfather. There was only one thing to do in this situation. Modesty had to come up with a means to thwart her mother's aims. She needed another unattached young woman in attendance at the dinner party her mother planned, someone to draw some of the gentlemen's attention away from Modesty. Her friend, Eleanor Cranshaw, would suit her purposes splendidly. And Eleanor would agree without hesitation once Modesty explained her dilemma. Later, she left the house in the company of a pair of maids, as her mother had insisted. But after they made their way through the formal gardens, Modesty turned toward the stables instead of continuing on and heading into the woods. The trees near Lower Nettlefold are ever so much better for mistletoe hunting, she assured the 2 young servants. Yes, Miss Gibbs, they responded in unison. The first part of her plan was going off without a hitch. Next, once they had collected the mistletoe, Modesty would instruct the driver to stop in at the cottage where Eleanor had lived with the vicar and his wife ever since she'd been orphaned as a young child. Modesty couldn't be expected to journey so near to her dearest friend in all the world and not pay a visit on her, after all. As the carriage crunched along the oyster shell drive leading from the Gibbs' large estate and rolled across the stone bridge over the Nettlerush River, which gave the manor house its name, Modesty felt suddenly eager to finish gathering the mistletoe, so that she could move on to the next step of her plan. What is Modesty Gibbs doing tramping around the woods that border on my land, in the dead of an English winter? Felton wondered, as he spied her and 2 young servant girls amongst the skeletal bare branches of elm and birch trees. He doubted the trio was out grouse hunting. For one thing, it was too late in the year, and he doubted they'd find a grouse within 100 miles of here. And for another, grouse hunting was generally considered a masculine pursuit. Rather than speculate further, Felton moved forward to discover her purpose. "Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Banfield," she greeted him when he drew near enough to catch her notice. "What a surprise to see you here." Her lips curved up in a smile. "I could say the same thing about you, Miss Gibbs. You're a fair way from Stonebridge Manor, after all." Her smile slipped a bit before she determinedly pinned it back in place. "Oh, yes, well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that mistletoe is most likely to be found in trees such as these." She waved her hand around to indicate their surroundings. A surprised laugh escaped him at that bit of nonsense, yet he tried to keep a straight face as he asked, "Is that correct?" "Oh, yes, of course." Her cheeks turned a delightful shade of pink, but he very much doubted that it was due to the chill in the air. She turned to the maids. "Why don't you try searching in those trees over there?" She pointed off to the side. "Since there are no good mistletoe trees nearer to Stonebridge Manor?" Felton asked. "Alas, no," she replied as the 2 servants moved off in the direction she'd indicated. "I'm not sure there's any mistletoe here," he remarked. "I haven't seen any hereabouts. Not that I was looking for it, mind you. I'm certain there must be a sprig or 2 around here somewhere," she persisted. What was the clever little minx going on about? Felton wondered. Though stubborn and opinionated, he enjoyed Modesty's lively nature. He suspected he would get no logical explanation for her actions, even if he pressed her for answers. "Perhaps I might help you in your search," he suggested instead. Her expression brightened in response. "How kind of you to offer your aid, Mr. Banfield. I accept most gratefully." He held out his arm, and she placed her hand atop his, allowing him to escort her between the trees as though they were taking a stroll in Hyde Park, rather than tramping through a winter-dead, wooded tract of Berkshire countryside. A chill wind blew from the north, rustling the handful of dried leaves that remained clinging desperately to the branches of the trees. "Is there any particular gentleman you hope to meet beneath the mistletoe?" he inquired, though he knew it was too much to hope that she might mention his own name. Actually, it's more of a matter of whom I hope to avoid, she surprised him with her reply. You fear a certain gentleman will try to catch you beneath the mistletoe and demand a kiss. She steered Felton in the opposite direction from the maids. He wondered if it was a deliberate move on her part, but her next words chased that thought from his head. Several gentlemen, in fact. Come again, he croaked, then cleared his throat. My mother and father have determined that I shall be betrothed before the Dukes, before Christmas Eve. Otherwise, they fear I will end up an old maid, a fate worse than death, apparently. At least, according to my mother. Even now, she is busy planning a dinner party, to which she intends to invite every fortunate hunting noble for miles around. Words escaped Felton in that moment. That Modesty's parents had so suddenly decided to marry her off, and with all possible haste, it seemed, made him most uncomfortable. He would almost suspect that Modesty was in a delicate condition if he didn't know her any better. But even 2 years in Paris could not have changed her so much. He felt certain of that. No matter her parents' reasons, he didn't like the thought of Modesty wed to some other man. Felton deemed few men of his acquaintance worthy of such a treasure. Most would not recognize her for the rare and priceless jewel she was, and would instead seek to snuff out her spirit. Felton would sooner cut out his own heart than ever cause damage to hers. Not that he believed for one instant that he stood any chance of gaining her hand himself. Even if the elder Gibbses had not desired a title for their daughter, Felton's scandalous reputation would prove an insurmountable obstacle to any parent's approval of him as a suitor for a respectable young miss. In Felton's own mind, he wasn't nearly good enough for Modesty. Why then should her parents judge him any less harshly? And he respected Reginald Gibbs too much to go against him, nor harbor any untoward thoughts toward the man's daughter. No, Felton would never consider pursuing Modesty, despite his strong feelings for her. Modesty seemed not to notice his lack of response to her words. Oh, look there! She pointed ahead of them. I see some mistletoe in that tree there. Felton glanced up and spotted the green leaves and distinctive whitish berries growing on a bare tree branch a dozen feet above their heads. Modesty removed her hand from his arm, leaving coldness to rush in and replace the warmth of her touch. She worried her bottom lip between her teeth. But how are we going to get it down from there? Allow me to retrieve it for you, he gallantly volunteered. He moved closer to the towering oak to determine the best course. He feared that climbing trees would no longer be the simple matter it had been when he was a boy. However, with only a small bit of effort, he grabbed onto a branch just above his head, and using his booted feet for purchase against the trunk, he pulled himself up onto the limb. Oh, do be careful, Mr. Banfield, Modesty called out from below him. I thank you for your concern, Miss Gibbs, he replied. Perching rather precariously while he stretched up his arm, he pulled the bunch of mistletoe free from the rough bark. He found getting back down was much easier than climbing up had been, since gravity helped him along the way. And if it was more of a falling descent than anything else more intentional on his part, Modesty was kind enough to not remark upon it. Once he had his feet planted firmly under him on the damp ground, he held the mistletoe up triumphantly in his hand. Modesty stepped closer to take the small branch from him, putting herself directly beneath it. And Felton couldn't resist leaning down and pressing his mouth to hers. He felt a moment of guilt for stealing a kiss when she had just been lamenting the gentleman who would seek to win her favor in pursuit of her dowry. Not that Felton cared a whit about her father's money, since he no longer had a desperate need to wed an heiress. Then Modesty's eager response sent heat rushing through his body, burning up all rational thought. Her lips were soft against his, her skin cool from the frosty, mist-shrouded air. Her hands came up to grip his overcoat as he drew her closer and wrapped his arms around her, the mistletoe slipping from his fingers to lay forgotten on the ground. It was sheer heaven until his senses returned, forcing him to pull away from her. Pray, forgive me, Miss Gibbs. I forgot myself for a moment. He put more distance between them, allowing the chill air to cool his raising ardor. We should seek out your maids. The light dimmed from Modesty's eyes as she nodded in agreement and turned back the way they'd come. Felton bent over to pick up the sprig of mistletoe, then followed behind her. As much as he wanted Modesty for himself, he would never bring dishonor to her and her family, her father especially, by attempting to convince her to go against her parents' wishes and elope with him instead. Chapter 4. You'll be doing a tremendous favor for me, Felton, if you consent to join us at tonight's dinner party, Reginald Gibbs stated. There was a late-minute addition to the guest list, a young woman who is a friend of Modesty's, and Mrs. Gibbs is all a-twitter that the numbers will not be even. She has put much effort into this evening, as she's invited several unattached gentlemen who we hope might prove to be a suitable match for Modesty. Of course. I'd be delighted, Felton answered, no matter that it wasn't strictly the truth. However, he felt under obligation to accept since the older man had just agreed to help fund Felton's latest business venture, after much heated and long drawn-out debate regarding the potential risks. Though the very last thing Felton desired to do was to watch other men vie for Modesty's notice in the hope of gaining her hand in marriage, and the large dowry which came with it. He bowed to the older man. I shall return at 4:30, he promised. Does that suit? Yes, that's fine. I'll look for you then. He pinched the bridge of his nose as though his head pained him greatly. Mrs. Gibbs is at her wits' ends, and has not given me a moment's peace. Besides, Modesty has some unreasonable notion to refuse anything save a love match. But I fear some title-less jackanapes will seek to compromise her to gain her dowry, and she shall suffer for her imprudently idealistic outlook. Then, I would be compelled to do something truly drastic. The older man sounded as though he expected that some unscrupulous man might try to force himself on Modesty against her will. The very idea was abhorrent to Felton. Yet, he couldn't help but think that the older man was referring to Felton himself with such remarks. Was Reginald Gibbs none too subtlety warning him off? But Modesty's father could not have known about the kiss they had shared in the woods near Felton's estate a few days before. Could he? If he did, that would explain why he'd agreed to fund Felton's latest venture, at last, in order to protect his daughter from what he perceived as Felton's dishonorable intentions toward her dowry. But an innocent mistletoe kiss was something altogether different. Felton hadn't forced his attentions on Modesty. He would never. Though he might have taken her by surprise, she'd been a willing partner in their kiss. And while his behavior toward the Duke of Kilmerstan's sister had been reprehensible, Felton had merely tried to convince her to elope with him to Gretna Green. And very nearly succeeded. His method had not been seduction, however. She'd had stars in her eyes and been swept away by the romance of it all, and a few meaningless romantic gestures. To discover now that the man he admired above all others was calling his honor into question. It was beyond what Felton wished to endure. I shall see myself out. The mere thought of the older man's possible lack of faith in him left an ill feeling in the pit of Felton's stomach as he left Stonebridge Manor. Nonetheless, he returned later that evening, as promised. When he entered the house, Mrs. Gibbs seemed surprised by his arrival. Had her husband failed to mention that there would be one more guest at dinner? No matter. Felton was there now, and he intended to get through the next few hours by whatever means necessary, until he could reasonably take his leave once more without giving rise to gossip. Hopefully, those means would not require him to fight another duel after calling out one of Modesty's would-be suitors. But the night was still young. Despite the delicious food placed before him, he lost all appetite as he watched the other men present make utter fools of themselves in an attempt to gain Modesty's favor. One mortifyingly forward young gentleman proved to be a particular thorn in Felton's side. Remembering Reginald Gibbs's remarks earlier that day in his study, Felton felt his anger raise. Obviously, a fortune-hunting future viscount was more than acceptable to Modesty's parents, so long as the young man stood to inherit a title. Of good family, but impoverished means, Morgan Mead's grandfather, the former Viscount of Laxenburg, had proved to be a very poor estate manager, allowing the ancestral lands and grand manor house in nearby Westerham to fall into a regrettable state of disrepair. The meal was only made tolerable for Felton by Modesty's friend, Eleanor Cranshaw, seated on his right. An amiable young woman, with light brown hair and pale grey eyes, she was a pleasant companion as she engaged him in quiet, banal conversation. As one course was removed and the next brought out, it seemed almost as though he and Miss Cranshaw resided inside their own little bubble, apart from the majority of the dinner guests vying for Modesty's attention. But as pleasing as Eleanor Cranshaw was, she did not affect Felton in the way that Modesty seemed able to without effort or intent. Nor could Miss Cranshaw hope to hold his full focus when Modesty sat across the table from him. The dinner party proved to be a comedy of errors, in Modesty's estimation. Though she could find little humor in the situation since she had been forced to play one of the leading roles in this evening's farce. Perhaps she should have likened it to a tragedy instead. Eleanor's presence had not had the desired effect, since she possessed neither name nor fortune to recommend her as a marriage prospect for the assembled gentlemen. And the only man Modesty had an interest in had been seated across the table while she suffered through the other males' attentions as they highlighted their dubious attractions through word and deed. The aged, rail-thin Earl of Markham had almost come to grief when he'd tripped over the edge of the Aubusson rug in the front parlour when he'd shuffled forward to bow over Modesty's hand. Then he had fallen asleep in his soup during the first course, accompanied by loud snores, only to jerk awake a short while later and demand to know what so many people are doing in my bedchamber at this time of the night. The Marquis of Sedgwick, in his middle years and with a considerable girth, had spent more than 3/4 of an hour relating stories about what holy terrors his 8 sons were, aged 17 to 2. Though he claimed the twins were merely showing their cleverness by hiding a snake in their governess's bed. Little wonder why the poor woman had quit without notice. But worse of all, Morgan Mead, heir to the Viscount of Laxenburg, had spent the whole of the dessert course detailing the deteriorated state of his family's entailed properties, and giving an accounting down to the last halfpenny of how much money would be required to complete all the needed repairs, making no bones about the fact that the size of Modesty's dowry served as her greatest enticement for him. The refurbishments to Laxenburg House alone will run in the tens of thousands of pounds, he felt no compunction in divulging. You must see why I am in want of a wealthy wife to refill the family coffers. Yet, he seemed to be the one Georgina Gibbs favoured, for some unfathomable reason utterly unknown to Modesty. True, he was young and handsome, with a full head of light blonde hair, all his own teeth, no unruly dependents, and a dashing air when his pompous pretensions didn't get in the way. But Modesty required more than superficial charm and a fair face in a potential husband. Especially when the gentleman in question was penniless, as well. By the end of the evening, she was even more determined than ever to find a way to escape her mother's horrid attempts at matchmaking. Particularly, since she'd passed a miserable hour following dinner when the assembled guests had repaired to the parlour, dodging countless attempts by a certain gentleman to catch her underneath the copious sprigs of mistletoe, which her mother had scattered about the room. Just when Modesty had thought she'd discovered all the areas best avoided, it seemed the parasitic plant spread to a new spot in order to catch her unawares. She would have felt much merrier about the dratted Christmas tradition if Felton had been the one endeavouring to steal a kiss. A few evenings later at Baron Ockley's country dance, Modesty was again at great pains to evade the persistent pursuit of Morgan Mead, future Viscount of Laxenburg. He cornered her near a small potted evergreen tree she had hoped would screen her, thus sparing her from further interactions with unwanted suitors. I intend to speak to your father, Mr. Mead informed her after a few minutes of tiresome banalities. She wished she could tell him to not bother, but her mother would have a fit of apoplexy if she heard Modesty discouraging a future Viscount suit. Modesty had to bite her tongue to hold back the words she yearned to utter. She longed for the freedom she'd enjoyed in Paris. And she missed her grandmamma dreadfully. The English gentry were so much more rigid and stuffy than the French. After we're married, Laxenburg's heir started. Modesty stopped listening then, however. If she had any say in the matter, they would never marry. But it likely wasn't up to her to decide. Alas, she feared her wants mattered not a whit, since her mother and father were determined to see her wed to a member of the aristocracy. Shall I partner you during the next set, Miss Gibbs? Modesty found this gentleman's fervent forwardness terribly off-putting, and she opened her mouth to demur. In truth, I'm in need of some refreshment, Mr. Mead. Of course. I shall procure a glass of punch for you and return in a trice. She accepted gratefully, breathing a relieved sigh as he departed and made his way to the far side of the large ballroom. I believe this dance is mine, is it not, Miss Gibbs? Modesty turned at the sound of Felton's voice, grateful for his timely rescue. She did not care to be standing around like a bump on a log upon Mr. Mead's inevitable return. Yes, it is, Mr. Banfield, she agreed, though, in truth, her dance card had no name written down next to this dance. As Felton led her out to the centre of the ballroom floor, the candlelight glinted on his red hair, making it blaze like the flickering flames overhead. His blue eyes lit with what appeared to be joy when she placed her hand in his. Or was she allowing her foolish heart to run away with her, imagining things that were not there? They joined the line of dancers forming, Felton's gaze taking in Modesty's loveliness. Her silky, dark hair was swept up at the back of her head with a few curls left loose to caress her bared shoulders. She wore a gown in a light bluish-green shade with a silver net overlay. The orchestra began playing a lively tune, and Felton and Modesty moved through the figures of a quadrille. They parted for a moment as the steps of the dance drew them apart, then they came back together again. "How goes the husband hunting?" he asked, disregarding the fact that he did not truly desire to know whether Modesty was shortly to be betrothed. "According to Mother? Splendidly. Unfortunately." Her velvet brown eyes seemed darker, her skin a shade paler than usual. "I'm certain Papa expects to receive an offer for my hand any day soon." It felt every bit as painful to hear her say the words as he had imagined. So, he didn't ask if Morgan Mead was the gentleman in question. Felton didn't wish to know the particulars. He especially didn't wish to picture her and Mead together. He remained silent until the quadrille had come to an end. As they left the dance floor, Mead stepped forward to meet Modesty, a cup of punch in hand. Felton bumped into him, causing several drops to splash on the other man's pristine white waistcoat. "My apologies, old chap," Felton said, as the liquid seeped into the fabric, looking like tiny spots of blood. With a glare at Felton, Mead handed Modesty the glass of punch and excused himself, dabbing at his front with a napkin. It might have been a petty act on Felton's part, but at least the accident had served to send the other man into retreat to repair the damage. Thus, freeing Modesty from Mead's odious presence for a short time, at least. Chapter 5. "Be still, Modesty," her mother admonished, as the seamstress pinned the hem of the dark green ball gown, an elaborate creation containing yards of heavy velvet and satin. Hundreds of sparkling jewels were sewn onto the rich fabric, catching the light from the leaded glass window with Modesty's every fidget. The final dress fitting was taking much longer than Modesty had expected. The seamstress from Upper Nettlefold had arrived at Stonebridge Manor with Modesty's new gown well over 3/4 of an hour ago. Or perhaps Modesty simply lacked the patience to stand docilely like a tousled-up Christmas goose ready for roasting. Though, all in all, she might well prefer the goose's fate over the one her parents had planned for her. Nonetheless, she straightened her posture and made a valiant effort to remain motionless. Although a week had passed since Baron Ockley's county dance, her feet still ached. Her mother had refused to allow her to sit out even one dance, no matter how Modesty's jewel-encrusted slippers had pinched her toes and rubbed her skin raw. By the end of that night, her poor abused feet had been crying for relief. To say nothing of her poor beleaguered spirit, having been forced to suffer through Mr. Mead's idea of courtship for much of the evening. "The future Viscount of Laxenburg has spoken with your father, and Mr. Gibbs is inclined to give his consent to the match," her mother remarked, as though she'd heard Modesty's thoughts. Modesty could scarcely take in the older woman's words, and her heart jumped into her throat, making any reply impossible in that moment. It was simply beyond bearing that Modesty should be forced to wed a man not of her choosing. Especially one she found as detestable as Morgan Mead. Once an engagement was announced, her parents would never allow her to cry off, however. Something must be done post-haste. Before Modesty found herself trapped in a union with a man she could never hope to love, and with no means of escape. At dinner that evening, she informed her mother and father that she intended to visit Eleanor at the vicarage in Lower Nettlefold the next day. "But I will return home on the following morning, in plenty of time to attend the Duke's ball 3 days hence," she assured them. Though that was not her true intent. She planned to visit Eleanor, as she'd said. However, she would not return home until after it was too late to attend the ball. Not that she truly believed missing the Duke's Christmas ball would make much difference in the ultimate outcome of her parents' bid to buy her a title, other than to delay it a bit. But she'd snatch at any sort of reprieve open to her. Given enough time, Modesty might yet find a way out of this predicament. It was the season of miracles, after all. Perhaps if she put up enough impediments, Mr. Mead would change his mind. Though she feared it was too much to hope unless another vastly wealthy heiress was close at hand to stumble conveniently into his path. Upon Modesty's arrival at the vicar's house in Lower Nettlefold the following day, she sent her father's coach and coachman back to Stonebridge Manor, excusing her actions by saying that her mother might wish to make use of the carriage for a trip into Upper Nettlefold, in order to purchase some last-minute odds or ends for the Duke's ball. The servant had departed without demur. "We must pay a call on Miss Henning while I am here," Modesty suggested midway through the afternoon, after spending several cozy hours with Eleanor in front of a blazing fire at the vicarage. "I don't know." Eleanor glanced doubtfully at the window. "It looks as though it might snow." "Nonsense," Modesty replied. "That's no reason to forego a visit with our favorite former teacher from our time together at St. Bernadette's School for Girls." After a bit more urging on Modesty's part, she and Eleanor, accompanied by the vicar and his wife, headed out under lowering skies to walk the half-mile to Miss Henning's cottage. Not long after they arrived at their destination, a chilling mix of sleet and hailstones began to fall. "Sir, a letter has arrived for you," Felton's butler-cum-valet announced the next day, interrupting a late luncheon. "Thank you, Bindle," Felton relied, taking the vellum from the other man's hand. Recognizing Reginald Gibbs' seal, he broke the wax and opened the letter to quickly scan its contents. "Is the messenger waiting for a reply?" "Yes, sir. I sent him to the kitchens for a spot of tea." Felton pushed his chair back from the table and headed into his study, where he sat at his desk to retrieve a fresh quill pen and ink well. He quickly scratched out a response, then sanded and sealed the parchment and handed it off the Bindle. "Please fetch my hat and coat, and inform the stable lad to saddle my horse." "Right away, sir." Once Felton was alone once more, he gave his emotions free rein. Had something happened to Modesty that she had not returned home to Stonebridge Manor as expected? Or was she plotting ways to avoid certain gentlemen again? She had gone to visit her friend Eleanor Cranshaw in Lower Nettlefold, though she'd promised to return in time for the Duke of Kilmerstan's ball. But when the Gibbs carriage had arrived at the vicarage this morning, Modesty was nowhere to be found. Her parents were understandably frantic that the carriage had returned home again without her. However, Felton wondered how much of their concern stemmed from the fact that the Duke's ball was scheduled for the next day. Nonetheless, Reginald has asked for Felton's help in locating Modesty, since his estate was situated only a short distance from the vicarage in Lower Netterfold. No matter the other man's motives, Felton intended to aid in the search however he was able. A quarter hour later, he raised his fist to knock on the wooden door of the vicarage, and then stepped back to wait. The vicar's housekeeper answered the door after a few moments. "Yes?" "Is the vicar at home?" he queried. "No, sir." He and his wife accompanied Miss Eleanor and Miss Gibbs to visit one of the girls' former teachers from St. Bernadette's. The older woman wrung her hands. "Today was my morning off, and I was surprised to arrive a short time ago to find they were still away. I expected them back before now. You don't think something happened to them, do you?" Her lined face pinched with worry. "I'm certain they were merely delayed by the storm," he replied. "Do you know the teacher's direction?" "Miss Henning rents a cottage on the east side of the village." "Do you know it?" He nodded in response. "Yes. I shall head that way now and look for them." "Thank you, sir." During Felton's 14 months in Lower Nettlefold, he'd had no difficulty in meeting most of its inhabitants. He also had an excellent memory and recognized Miss Henning's name immediately, also remembering the location of her cottage. He left the vicarage quickly and arrived there without difficulty. When the older woman opened the door to his knock, her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, Mr. Banfield. This is indeed unexpected. What might I do for you?" "Can you tell me if the vicar is visiting here?" he asked. "Yes. He's just in the sitting room." "Come in, please." She stepped back to allow him to enter the small two-story cottage. He found the vicar in the front parlor, along with Modesty and Eleanor, and an older woman, the vicar's wife, each with a cup of tea in hand. The older man stood at Felton's entrance. "Mr. Banfield, what brings you here?" Felton bowed to the women and then turned to address the other man. "Miss Gibbs' father has sent me in search of her. He desires her return home." "Of course." The vicar set aside his teacup and dusted off his hands. "We should be getting on, as well. It's well past time for us to make our way back to the vicarage," he remarked, as though he had said that very thing more than once before. Felton bowed again to the three women. "I shall fetch my carriage and return for Miss Gibbs, to convey her home." "Thank you, Mr. Banfield." A hint of relief had crept into the vicar's tone. The vicar's manner confirmed Felton's suspicions that this had all been part of some plot dreamed up by Modesty, though he was unclear as to what exactly she hoped to gain by it. Once the other three had left the room to say their farewells to Miss Henning, Felton turned to face Modesty, stepping in front of her to block the doorway. "I shall return with my coach with all possible haste. Do not make me chase you down a second time." "I didn't make you chase me down the first time," she protested, a front clear on her features. "We were merely visiting Miss Henning, my former teacher from St. Bernadette School for Girls, and last night's storm prevented our departure until now." He silently scoffed at that Barbary tale, but he didn't bother to refute her words. The sleeting rain and hail had stopped sometime during the night, and though the roads remained muddy, they were passable. It was therefore quite easy for Felton to drive the short distance from Miss Henning's house to the vicarage to drop off the vicar and his wife as well as Eleanor. When he stopped at his estate to inform his valet that he planned to transport Modesty back to Stonebridge Manor, he found the Gibbs coach pulled up at the base of the front stairs leading to the Carlin portico. He expected to find Reginald and Mrs. Gibbs inside awaiting him, but he discovered they had merely sent the coachman to collect Modesty, as before. Clearly, they hadn't been too troubled over Modesty's welfare. Either that, or the older couple had absolute faith in Felton's abilities to locate their daughter and convince her to return home. If that were the case, then in all likelihood, Reginald must not have been hinting that Felton lacked integrity that day in the older man's study, which came as a relief to Felton. But he didn't fool himself that the man's goodwill toward him extended to accepting Felton as a suitor for Modesty's hand. Felton could have sent Modesty home in her parents' carriage and been done with the matter, but he didn't trust her not to attempt another trick, knowing how opposed she was to the match her parents hoped to make for her. Not that Felton could fault Modesty's wish to avoid that milksop, Mead. Nonetheless, he would see her safely escorted home himself. As they left the small village of Lower Nettlefold behind, Modesty gazed through the window at Felton, riding his horse beside the carriage. She lowered the window to address him. "It isn't necessary for you to escort me the entire way home, Mr. Banfield." He didn't respond directly to her words. Instead he said, "Tell me truthfully, why do you wish to avoid the Duke's ball?" "I never said that I—" Her cut her off with a stern look. She huffed out a sigh. "Very well. I fear that when next they meet, Papa will give his consent for Mr. Mead to ask for my hand." Felton's pale blue eyes iced over like a frozen lake, and she shivered in reaction. Or perhaps it was only due to the cold air flooding into the carriage through the open window. She pulled the lap robe more tightly around herself. The coach's wheels churned up the patches of snow on the ground, turning them a muddied brown color. Felton remained silent for a moment longer before he responded to her words. "You shall make an admirable Viscountess Laxenberg." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I don't wish to be a Viscountess. Your parents desire a title for you. A title in exchange for her father's money. I do not share their ambition," she snapped. Her mother and father wished to see her wed to a peer, so that she and her children, their grandchildren, would be members of the aristocracy. If she married Mr. Mead, her oldest son would one day inherit the title of Viscount. But Modesty feared she would be compelled to commit murder to hasten things long before the beastly man died of natural causes. While Modesty wanted her children to have every advantage, she refused to marry a man she did not love. Everything she might gain through such a union could not outweigh what she would be required to give up. "I'm going to ride ahead to let Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs know you're on your way. Don't stop for anything," Felton instructed the coachman as they neared Upper Nettlefold, "no matter what Miss Gibbs might demand." "Yes, sir." Felton urged his horse into a trot and quickly outpaced the slower-moving carriage. The scar on his face pained him in the bitterly cold winter wind. He had survived the Peninsular War unscathed, thanks to Lord George Halingbroke, whose brave actions had saved Felton's life in France. Though, tragically, the man's brother, Brandon, had been killed on the field of battle. There were innumerable times that Felton doubted it had been a fair trade. Brandon Halingbroke was a good man, yet he'd been struck down in his prime. While Felton had returned home to English soil and, shortly thereafter, had been shot by his former friend in a duel. Deservedly so, many would say. Never mind that Felton had returned from the war to find his father had died and left the family with nearly insurmountable debts. Desperation had compelled Felton to make an attempt to marry an heiress without taking the time necessary for a traditional courtship. And Lady Isabel's dowry had been more substantial than most. But no longer did he need a wealthy bride to pull him out of financial difficulties. Unfortunately, the only woman he desired for a wife would shortly be betrothed to another. If not Meade, then someone else. Felton needed distance from Modesty in order to accept the fact that she would soon be forever out of his reach. That she would truly never be his. Chapter 6. Modesty sat fuming inside the carriage as it drew ever closer to home. How dare Felton command her father's coachman to ignore her orders? The nerve of the man! The carriage jerked to a sudden stop, tossing Modesty from the padded squabs onto the floor between the seats. Righting herself and resuming her perch on the cushioned bench, she raised the window shade to discover what had happened. But from her vantage point, she couldn't see the reason why the coach and four had come to such an unexpected halt against Felton's express instructions. "You in the fancy carriage," a rough voice called. "Come out of there peaceable-like, or I'll shoot your driver." Fear gripped Modesty's heart. She opened the door cautiously and peered into the gloom to see two uncouth ruffians standing at the side of the road with pistols drawn. "Looky there, Mort, we got ourselves a real proper lady," the smaller of the two men sneered. "Well, come on, then. Get out of there." He waved his pistol at her to hasten her along. Modesty didn't think the man would appreciate a lecture on how she should be properly addressed and the various distinctions between a lady and a miss. Now wasn't the time to quibble over such unimportant details, at any rate. She struggled to climb down to the ground without the aid of the step. But neither man was possessed of enough decency to lower it for her, and they held the coachman at gunpoint, preventing him from performing the duty. She landed hard and lost her balance, narrowing, avoiding falling face first into the muck of the road. Thankfully, she caught herself at the last moment. But that seemed to be the only thing she had to be grateful about, as she contemplated the dire situation in which she found herself. She chanced a quick glance up at the box where her coachman perched, and saw him sitting motionless, loosely gripping the reins. "Don't you worry, Miss Gibbs," he valiantly tried to soothe her. "Quiet," barked the smaller highwayman. Modesty's breath was visible in front of her in the chill winter air, and a layer of frost covered the ground. She pulled the edges of her coat close around her to ward off the freezing temperature. Her slippers sank into the mud on the road, ruining them beyond repair. Cold and wetness seeped through the thin material to her feet. But her discomfort was the least of her troubles. "Hand over your valuables, or we'll kill you and then take them fancy jewels anyway." The larger highwayman pointed his pistol directly at her heart. It held only a single shot, but that didn't ease her fear at all, as she noticed that he had a second blunderbuss tucked into his belt. Besides, he only needed one lead ball to end her life. He smiled cruelly, exposing a mouthful of rotten teeth. The sight sent a shiver racing down Modesty's spine. Had she made a grave error trying to thwart her parents' aim to marry her off to the future Viscount of Luxembourg? Would she pay for her foolishness with her life? Felton hadn't travelled far when a sudden gunshot shattered the hushed winter silence around him, transporting him back to the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo. But he quickly shook the image from his head. The shot had come from somewhere behind him. "Modesty," he gasped in terror. Felton spun his mount in a sharp turn and kicked the horse into a gallop, heading back toward Modesty. He only prayed he wasn't too late. He rounded a bend in the road in time to see that the driver of the Gibbs carriage had been shot, a rapidly expanding stain of red darkening the front of his greatcoat. Yet, the man was still able to point a large coaching pistol at one of the highwaymen standing on the ground. He pulled the trigger, finding his mark before the other blackguard put a second lead ball into the coachman. The pistol slipped from the servant's grip, and he slumped to the seat atop the driver's box, as the wounded highwayman turned tail and disappeared back into the woods from whence he'd come, leaving Felton to face down the lone remaining highwayman. Felton cursed the fact that he didn't have a dueling pistol with him, as the blackguard pulled a second pistol from the belt at his waist. He pointed the pistol at Modesty, and Felton reacted without thought, jumping in front of the other man and knocking into his arm to throw off his aim. The gun went off with a loud report, and Modesty screamed. Felton waited to feel the pain, but it never came. Had Modesty been hit instead? Please, no. Dear God, please. Fear filled his heart. He wouldn't want to live in this world if she weren't in it, even if he could never claim a connection closer than mere friends. But he didn't have time to turn around and check on her before the highwayman tried to rack Felton on the side of the head with the heavy pistol. He blocked the move and wrestled the weapon from the other man. Faced with a worthy opponent and the defection of his former accomplice, the blackguard seemed to lose his nerve. He shoved away from Felton and made his escape into the trees in search of easier pickings. Felton would have chased him down, except his concern for Modesty was too great to willingly leave her alone for even one more moment. He spun on his heels and rushed to her side. He didn't see any signs of blood. "Are you injured?" he asked urgently. Modesty laid a gentle hand against his chest, over his pounding heart. "I'm quite all right, Felton. You saved me." "Thank you." He placed his hand over hers. "Thank the Lord, you're unharmed." "Are you unharmed, as well?" Concern darkened her brown eyes. "Yes." "Have no fear." Her fingers dug in, gripping the fabric covering his chest. "I don't know what I would have done if you'd been killed." He caressed the back of her hand, trying to calm her. "Then there would have been no one standing between you and a very dangerous man." She shook her head, silky dark strands of hair tumbling from the knot pinned at her nape. "That's not what I meant. I would never want anything dreadful to happen to you, Felton." "What are you saying?" It couldn't be what he hoped. Could it? Modesty's throat closed up and the words refused to come. But then she took a deep breath and pressed forward. "I care about you, Felton. Deeply." He shook his head. Though whether in denial or disbelief, she didn't know. "It's true. You have no idea how long I've yearned to hear those words." She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand to forestall her. "I love you, Modesty, but you must know that we can never be together." What should have been the happiness moment of Modesty's life instead felt like a lead weight pressing down on her heart. How could she have survived being set on by highwaymen only to have her heart shattered into 100 pieces by Felton's words? She didn't accept them. She couldn't. "I don't understand. Why can't we be together?" she demanded. His gaze softened with regret. "Your parents would never allow a marriage between us. If that was the only thing standing in their way, they could elope. Neither she nor Felton needed her father's money. But what if there was something else holding him back? You truly wish to marry me?" "More than anything." Joy filled her. "Then nothing is impossible." Her gown was covered in mud from the road and a drizzling rain had begun to fall around them, but she didn't care. She hardly felt the dampness seeping through her clothing as the warmth of Felton's love kept her from feeling chilled. A determined expression hardened his strong features. "I won't come between you and your parents." Then Modesty would just have to ensure that her parents gave their blessing to the union. "I'll speak to my father and mother. I'll make them see that we belong together. Because I love you, too. And I shall not be happy with any other man as my husband. A title does not bring contentment." Though Felton appeared doubtful that the outcome would be as she hoped, he nodded in agreement. Modesty raised herself on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips, a smile breaking free. A moment later, she came back to earth with a thud. "The coachman!" She gasped in sudden horror, remembering that the poor man had been shot, and she and Felton hadn't given a thought for him once the danger had passed. "I'll be all right, Miss Gibbs," the man answered from the coach. "Those blokes had terrible bad aim." A small, somewhat strangled laugh accompanied his words. Modesty glanced toward the coachman to see that he was now climbing down from the box and bracing himself against the carriage, as he clearly required it for support. She rushed to his side, fearful that his wound might be more grievous than he was letting on. "Don't fret now, miss," he scolded. Though his face was pale, he wore a hint of a smile. Felton stepped forward and wrapped his arm around the coachman's waist. "Let's get you into the carriage, and I'll drive us to the doctor in Upper Nettlefold to get you patched up." Chapter 7. As Felton and Modesty approached Stonebridge Manor a short time later, Felton didn't hold out much hope that Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs, most especially the latter, would willingly accept him as a son-in-law, despite Modesty's confident manner. Not when he lacked an all-important title. At the sound of the carriage pulling up at the front steps, the door of the house flew open, and Modesty's mother came rushing outside. "Modesty, thank heavens you've returned. We feared you would miss the Duke of Kilmerstan's Christmas Eve ball." Modesty's father followed behind his wife at a slower pace. "Felton, thank you for seeing our daughter home safe to us." Felton jumped down from the driver's box in order to hand Modesty down from the carriage. Just then the older woman caught sight of the muddied state of Modesty's clothing. "Whatever happened to your gown?" she cried with distress. Modesty answered before Felton had a chance. "We were set upon by highwaymen, and the coachman was shot." "But Felton, Mr. Banfield saved the day." "But are you quite all right?" her mother asked, her face going pale. "Only because of Mr. Felton's intervention," Modesty said, pride filling her words. "You have our deepest gratitude, Felton." Reginald reached out to shake Felton's hand, his grip strong and his expression heartfelt. "How can we ever repay you?" Again, Modesty responded before Felton could form words to reply. "Actually, Papa, we'd like to speak with you about something." Felton placed a hand on her arm, stopping her from continuing. "I'd prefer to speak with your father alone first," he requested. Modesty's eyebrows knit together in concern, but after a brief moment of hesitation, she nodded. "I'll go above stairs and change into a clean gown." Once the women had disappeared inside the house, Reginald waved a hand to Felton, indicating he should precede the older man. "Let's adjourn to my study." Felton had barely settled in the wingback chair facing Reginald Gibbs' desk when there was a loud shriek from down the hall. An instant later, the study door burst open to reveal Modesty's mother. "I won't have it, Reginald." She placed her fists on her hips, her features turning red. Apparently, Modesty had spoken to her mother. The older man seemed not at all bothered by his wife's irate manner, however. "Won't have what, dear?" he asked calmly. "Modesty has just informed me of her intention to marry Mr. Banfield." She speared Felton with a withering look. The foolish girl has clearly lost her wits. "I won't have it, I tell you. Reginald, you must do something about this, at once." His gaze turned to Felton, one bushy eyebrow arched imperiously. But he addressed his next remarks to his wife. "Please, leave us. I'd like to speak to Felton in private." Once the door had slammed shut behind her, the older man steepled his hands before him. "What do you have to say for yourself?" A lump had formed in Felton's throat, but he swallowed it down. "I love your daughter, sir. And she loves me. I know my past does not inspire confidence, but the thing I want above all else is your daughter's happiness. I cannot offer her a title, much to my regret. But if you give me the chance, I'll prove myself worthy of her regard. I'll prove that you could not find a kinder and more loving husband for your daughter." Reginald got up and paced the room, his face contorted into a huge frown. Felton held his breath. "I see," the older man finally grumbled. He stopped pacing and stared at Felton. "I see," he said again. He stared at Felton for a long moment before walking circles again on the finely woven rug. Felton didn't move, he merely waited for what was sure to be a resounding refusal. But the scowl on Reginald's face had relaxed a bit, looking markedly less ferocious. He settled himself back behind his desk, his scrutiny not leaving Felton. "Years ago, Mrs. Gibbs' parents wanted her to have a title, too," he said slowly. "But my wife wanted me, at least, at first." Felton nodded, unsure where the conversation was going. Modesty has never cared about acquiring a title. Reginald tapped his fingers against the surface of his desk. "That is her mother's ambition. And I have allowed Mrs. Gibbs to push her own aspirations onto Modesty." He gave a rueful laugh. "As it turns out, Georgina grew to lament the fact that she fell in love with me instead of a titled man. I expect she doesn't want Modesty to end up in the same circumstance." He sighed as though a great weight was pressing on his shoulders. "But Modesty is nothing like Georgina. If Modesty is truly content with this match, then despite the grief I will face, I shall give my blessing." Felton jumped from his chair, hardly believing his ears. A grin split his face. "Thank you, sir. You do me a great honor." "Thank you." Reginald waved his hand. However, if Modesty ever wants for anything, anything at all. She won't, sir, she won't. I give you my solemn oath on that. Felton still couldn't believe the turn of events. He wished to seek out Modesty without delay, but the older man's next word stopped him. I've always had admiration for you, Felton, no matter that you've made your fair share of mistakes. After all, what man does not have events in his past that are regrettable? Felton turned to face the other man as Reginald continued. I would be proud to call you son. Felton was embarrassed to feel hot tears burn his eyes. That means a great deal to me, sir. More than the older man would ever comprehend. Well, go on. Reginald gestured toward the door. I'm sure Modesty is waiting for you. Felton found Modesty in the front parlor. Her mother, thankfully, was nowhere in sight. Your father had given us his consent, Felton relayed, still reeling in shock. Modesty's radiant smile chased away the fog of numbness inside him, and happiness rushed in to fill all the frozen crevices of his heart. If her expression looked a touch smug, it was only to be expected. I knew everything would turn out all right, she murmured. So you did. He got down on one knee before her. Modesty Gibbs, would you do me the very great honor of agreeing to be my wife? Yes, she answered without a moment's hesitation. Felton rose and seated himself beside her on the settee. Pulling her close to him, he pressed his lips against hers. The next evening, Modesty and her parents arrived at the Duke of Kilmerstan's grand manor house to attend his Grace's Christmas Eve ball. Once the Gibbs family was announced, they crossed the threshold to join the throng gathered inside. The ballroom was decorated with winter foliage. Pine boughs draped above the French windows, sprigs of holly with bright red berries in vases were arranged around the room, and strings of cranberries hung on the walls. The high ceilings were lit with the blaze of hundreds of candles in the golden chandeliers overhead. An orchestra was positioned in an alcove at one end of the vast room. By your leave, my dear, Modesty's father murmured, before quickly detaching himself from Modesty and her mother in order to search out Morgan Mead. He was in a hurry to exchange a quiet word with the gentleman who had thought to gain Modesty's hand in marriage. A few minutes later, the Duke's majordomo announced Felton's arrival. Modesty turned to watch her betrothed enter the ballroom. It caused a bit of a stir amongst the assembled guests, but Felton only had eyes for Modesty. He headed straight toward her. Mrs. Gibbs, Miss Gibbs, he greeted, bowing over each woman's hand, in turn. Good evening, Modesty responded, a smile stretching her lips wide. He turned to her mother. Mrs. Gibbs, might I claim your daughter for the next dance? Though the older woman had kicked up a huge fuss about this alliance, she was not about to provide fodder for gossip in front of the aristocracy. She gave Felton a forced smile and nodded with the regal bearing of someone who truly did have a title. You are in luck, Mr. Banfield, she replied with dignity. We have only just arrived ourselves, and Modesty's dance card is not yet full. Wonderful. He held his arm out to Modesty. Modesty placed her fingers atop the sleeve of Felton's black velvet coat, as proper decorum demanded, though she longed for a more substantial connection between them. She'd never missed Paris more than she did in this moment when she craved a greater closeness with Felton than the mere causal touches that English society deemed acceptable between unmarried couples. The orchestra struck up the first notes of a waltz, and Felton led her out onto the waxed parquet dance floor. I hope you'll grant me the next waltz, as well, he requested. I would save them all for you, if I could. She sighed in vexation. Oh, I wish we were announcing our betrothal tonight, so that I could partner you for more than the usual prescribed number of dances allowed in a single evening. We only need wait a few more weeks, he soothed, though joy lit his blue eyes at her impatience. Modesty's father and Felton had decided that it would be best to wait until the beginning of the new year to announce their plans to Wednesday. She sighed again. It will seem like an eternity. It will pass before you know it, and then we'll have the rest of our lives together. His gaze turned tender, even as it smoldered with banked heat. No matter the lack of an engagement announcement, this will be the happiest Christmas season in my memory. In mine, as well. He squeezed her hand, and her heart felt filled to overflowing. As he twirled her through the steps of the waltz, the hundreds of sparkling jewels sewn onto her gown flashed like green fire in the light cast by the candles suspended above their heads. Modesty could barely contain her excitement when she thought about their future together. Her heart was full as she imagined the day when they would become man and wife. As Felton twirled her yet again, she caught sight of a sprig of mistletoe. Perhaps she could maneuver Felton that direction until she stood directly beneath it, and then he would be forced to kiss her right there in public. The thought made her giggle out loud. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Grace Austen. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Grace Austen, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Grace Austen romance.